Imagine standing on a wooden scaffold in the heart of London, your wrists bound, your mouth parched, and your enemies screaming for your blood. The stench of sweat and sewage mingles with the metallic tang of fear in the air. Before you, thousands of English spectators surge like a living tide, hungry to witness a man torn apart in ways so grotesque it feels like something out of hell. It's August 23rd, 1305. And the man on that scaffold is not a nameless criminal. He is William Wallace, once Scotland's most feared warrior, the man who defied kings, rallied peasants, and for a fleeting, glorious moment made England tremble. But on this day, he is no hero, not to them. To the English crown, he is the embodiment of treason, and the punishment for treason is not death, at least not at first. First, you are broken, humiliated, torn down until nothing remains of you but a mangled body and a cautionary tale. Wallace will be dragged through the streets by horses until his flesh rips from bone, hanged until nearly dead, castrated while still conscious, his intestines ripped from his belly before his own fading eyes, and finally, his heart torn from his chest as the executioner proclaims it to the crowd, and then, only then, will he be allowed to die. It is one of the most savage executions in medieval history, but the real horror lies not just in how Wallace died, but why. Because William Wallace wasn't supposed to be a rebel, he was supposed to be forgotten. If you enjoy hidden truths like this, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's go back to where it all began, long before the blood and fire, when the man who would become Scotland's most defiant hero was just a shadow waiting to rise. The world William Wallace was born into was already cracked with tension, like a frozen lake just before it shatters. Scotland in the late 13th century was a land caught between its own fractured nobility and the crushing shadow of England. It was a place of stone castles perched on cliffs, peat bogs that swallowed men whole, and endless windswept hills where clans guarded their pride more fiercely than their lives. In 1286, Scotland's King Alexander III died suddenly after falling from his horse at night, leaving no surviving sons. The only heir was his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, who was just 3 years old. Nobles scrambled for influence, while the realm teetered on the edge of civil war. The Scots sought help from their southern neighbour, England, to arbitrate a peaceful succession. It was a decision that would haunt them. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks for his towering height and even taller ambition, saw not a troubled neighbour, but a ripe conquest. He agreed to mediate the Scottish succession, but secretly plotted to bring the kingdom under his control. When young Margaret died on her journey to Scotland in 1290, the throne was vacant. Edward invited the claimants to present their cases before him. What they didn't realise was that he had already decided the outcome and their submission to his authority. Edward chose John Balliol as king in 1292, but treated him as a puppet. Humiliated and undermined, Balliol eventually rebelled with French backing in 1296. Edward responded with brutal efficiency. He invaded, sacked Berwick in a bloodbath that killed thousands, and captured the Stone of Destiny, the sacred coronation stone of the Scots, taking it to Westminster as a trophy. Balliol was dethroned, and Scotland was left leaderless. The country descended into chaos. English garrisons occupied Scottish strongholds. Taxes bled the peasants. Any flicker of rebellion was stamped out in fire. And yet, resentment smouldered in the Highlands and Lowlands alike, waiting for a spark. That spark would come not from a noble, but from a man of mysterious origins. A tall, broad-shouldered knight with piercing eyes and a will of iron. His name was William Wallace, and though little is known of his early life, legends whisper he was born around 1270 near Elderslie. He was educated, possibly trained as a knight, and spoke both Latin and French, rare for common Scots. But what mattered most was not his birth, it was his fury. Wallace grew up watching his homeland humiliated. English sheriffs bullied the people, stripping them of their cattle, their lands, even their daughters. Justice belonged only to those who bowed to Edward. Wallace refused to bow. He struck his first blow in May 1297, killing the English sheriff of Lanark after a personal dispute. To the English, it was murder. To the Scots, it was the first cry of defiance. Within months, that cry became a roar. Farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, ordinary men who had nothing left to lose, flocked to Wallace's banner. He and fellow rebel Andrew de Moray waged a lightning campaign of ambushes and raids, harrying English supply lines, burning their outposts, and vanishing into the forests like ghosts. Edward dismissed them as bandits. He underestimated the power of desperation. In September 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace's ragtag force lured a vastly larger English army onto a narrow bridge over the River Forth. As the English crossed, the Scots struck like wolves, collapsing the bridge under their weight and slaughtering them in the river. It was a stunning, impossible victory. For the first time in years, Scotland breathed free air, and for the first time, Edward I felt something he despised: fear. But as Wallace rose, so did the stakes. England would not forgive this rebellion, and Edward would stop at nothing to break him. The storm was gathering, and Wallace was walking straight into its heart. After the triumph at Stirling Bridge, Wallace's name spread like wildfire across Scotland. Songs were sung about him in smoky taverns, whispered in candlelit monasteries, shouted from hillsides like a battle cry. To a people long crushed under foreign boots, he was more than a man. He was vengeance incarnate. The Scottish nobles, who had once mocked him as an upstart, now bent their pride. They named him Guardian of Scotland in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. Wallace had gone from outlaw to national leader in less than a year, and he wielded that new authority with merciless clarity. He knew that half measures would not save Scotland. He marched into northern England in late 1297, raiding towns, burning crops and seizing supplies. He wanted to show Edward that Scotland would not merely resist, it would strike back. These raids also served another purpose. They forced England to recall soldiers from Scottish soil, buying his people breathing room. But every victory carried a hidden shadow. The Scottish nobles who supported Wallace often did so reluctantly, jealous of his sudden fame. They were tied by blood and land to England and feared Edward's wrath more than they feared defeat. Wallace was fighting not just an empire, but the poisoned roots of his own country's politics. In July 1298, Edward returned to Scotland with a massive army of 15,000 men. Wallace met him at Falkirk with about half as many. The battle was brutal. Wallace's spearmen fought like demons behind wooden stakes, but Edward's longbowmen tore them apart. The Scots broke and fled. Wallace escaped, but his legend was cracked. By year's end, he resigned as guardian, replaced by nobles who quietly negotiated with Edward behind closed doors. Wallace disappeared from the records for several years. Some say he travelled to France seeking support from King Philip IV. Others belied that. He wandered Scotland like a hunted wolf, striking at English patrols, always moving, never resting. Edward thought the rebellion was dying. He was wrong. In 1303, Scotland rose again under Robert the Bruce and others. Wallace returned from the shadows, rallying small bands of loyalists. But the net was closing. Edward unleashed a relentless manhunt. Spies scoured the countryside. Rewards were offered. Friends turned traitor for gold. And in August 1305, betrayal found him. Wallace was captured near Glasgow by a Scottish knight named John de Menteith, a man he once trusted. He was bound in chains, dragged to London like a trophy, and locked in the Tower. The English people lined the streets just to glimpse him. The barbarian, the rebel, the myth. They expected a broken man, but Wallace stood tall, silent, eyes burning with defiance. It made them hate him more. He would not kneel to Edward. He would not beg for mercy, and for that they would make his death something the world would never forget. Wallace's rise had been meteoric. His fall would be medieval. The trial of William Wallace was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be theatre, a ritual humiliation staged for England's glory. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was brought before Westminster Hall, shackled but unbowed. The vast chamber echoed with the sneers of lords and the scratch of quills recording his doom. He was accused of treason against King Edward. Wallace's reply cut through the room like steel. He could not be guilty of treason because he had never sworn allegiance to Edward. The words stunned some, enraged others. To Edward's court, this was not defiance. It was blasphemy. There would be no jury, no defence, no mercy. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered, the most savage execution in English law. That morning, Wallace was stripped naked and tied to a hurdle, a wooden frame, then dragged by horses through the mud-slick streets of London for miles. The crowd jeered and hurled fires. The theatre, the once proud warrior bounced like a ragdoll over stones, his flesh shredded. Yet witnesses said he stared forward, lips tight, as if daring them to break him. At Smithfield he was hanged by the neck until nearly dead, then cut down, gasping. The executioner castrated him, severed his genitals and burned them before his eyes. His stomach was sliced open, his intestines pulled out slowly and fed to the flames while his heart still beat. And when they finally cut the heart from his chest, they held it up to the crowd, crying, "Behold the heart of a traitor!" Even in death they weren't done. His body was cut into 4 pieces, his head was dipped in tar and stuck on a pike atop London Bridge. His limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth, a grisly warning to all Scotland. Edward wanted the world to see not just that Wallace died, but that he was annihilated. Yet something strange happened. The English cheered, but the Scots whispered. Because Wallace had died exactly as he lived, defiant, unbroken and unafraid. And that terrified Edward more than any army. Edward believed Wallace's death would end the rebellion. Instead, it poured oil on the fire. News of his execution spread like a ghostly wind across the glens. Men who had once feared Edward now feared dishonouring Wallace's memory more. Even some Scottish nobles who had betrayed him felt a cold shame creep into their bones. Robert the Bruce, once hesitant, now burned with resolve. Within 2 years he declared himself King of Scots and waged a brutal guerrilla war against England. Edward poured army after army into Scotland, but it was as if the land itself rejected him. Castles were taken and retaken, villages were torched, fields turned to mud and bones. In 1307, Edward Longshanks died on campaign, still trying to crush the Scots. His son Edward II inherited the war but not the iron will. Bruce outmaneuvered him again and again, and in 1314, at Bannockburn, the Scots shattered the English army, winning their independence in all but name. Every victory carried Wallace's shadow. His martyrdom became the heartbeat of Scottish resistance. The English had tried to erase him, instead they made him immortal. But the consequences were not just political, they were human. Thousands died in the wars that followed, peasants and soldiers alike, their names lost to time, villages starved, plague followed famine, the land itself seemed to bleed. And yet, amid the carnage, the legend of Wallace only grew. Minstrels wove songs of his bravery, monks recorded tales of his battles, often embellished into near myth. He became not just a man, but a symbol of defiance, of freedom, of a people who would rather die screaming than live on their knees. This was what Edward never understood. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill what he represents. And what Wallace represented was an idea too powerful to hang, draw, and quarter. That idea now marched under Robert the Bruce's banner, and it would not stop until Scotland was free. Decades after Wallace's death, Scotland finally forced England to recognise its independence with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. Robert the Bruce was acknowledged as king, and for a brief moment the nation Wallace died for stood unshackled. But Wallace himself remained scattered, literally. His tarred head decayed above London Bridge until it was replaced by newer traitors. His severed limbs rotted on distant gates, their locations eventually forgotten. He had no grave, no marker, nothing to mourn but a legend. And yet, maybe that was fitting. Because Wallace had never fought for monuments or crowns, he fought for something simpler and more dangerous, the belief that an ordinary man could defy an empire. That belief outlived Edward, outlived the gallows, outlived even the bones of those who watched him die. Centuries later, when Scotland again faced political and cultural erasure, Poe, Tears and Patriots resurrected his memory. Blind Harry's epic poem in the 1400s turned Wallace into a mythic hero. Statues rose in Stirling. His name became a banner for freedom, long after his body was ashes. There is a strange kind of immortality in martyrdom. Wallace never saw the Scotland he dreamed of, but because he died, others lived to build it. And there is a darker lesson too. Empires believe they can crush resistance with terror, but terror breeds martyrs, and martyrs breed rebellion. The very cruelty meant to erase Wallace only engraved him deeper into history. As you listen to this now, centuries later, think about that. A man whose heart was cut from his chest still lives on in whispers, in stories, in stone. And somewhere, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of his defiance, carried on the wind over Scotland's wild hills. Subscribe for more, share this story, and tell me in the comments what shocked you most.